So here are the two acronyms of the day. BDD and E2E testing. So BDD is behavior or business-driven development. I think officially it's behavior-driven development, but you see people using the two words and very interchangeably. The idea is just it's very similar to test-driven development, where test-driven development you will write your test first before you start. But behavior-driven development, you will do that in the same way, but it is much more revolving around what you want the application to do rather than how you want the code to work. So you write the business logic as opposed to writing the code before you even start. So the concept revolves around writing user stories in the same way that you'd write a user story of as a person in this role, I want to be able to do this so that I can do this. And it allows you to get a client or a QA or just someone not technical involved really early on. They can write these tests essentially. They can write the way that you would then put them into a Trello board. You can get someone to write that, and you pretty much just copy and paste it into a file to write your tests. So the most common way of writing BDD is using a framework called Cucumber, which uses a language called Gherkin.
I see a pattern here.
Yeah. So most people don't acknowledge that Gherkin is actually the language, but if you're using syntax highlighting and stuff, it's good to know. But Cucumber is really the only one that people actually use. So it's a way of writing your tests in a more natural way. And so you can see on the right here, hopefully that's big enough, because I don't really know how to enlarge it anyway, that here we have a feature file, and the idea is that you outline what your feature is, and you just give it a simple name that you want to, which is how you want it to appear in your test runner. You give it a little description, which is just for when you're looking through the test or you're writing more. You then have scenarios, which are the same as the independent tests that you would see in the same way that we saw last week with Chris writing unit tests. Each one of those was run independently, and it's the same thing with the scenarios. So they have this concept of given, when, and then. They're interchangeable. Really you're only writing the code for each one once, but it's some syntactic sugar to make it read naturally, and you can just write it as a sentence, which makes it very accessible for non-developers, people like that. For instance, I was just talking to John, and I said that John might be interested in this as well, because he would be able to write these probably quite easily, because he doesn't need to write any code. So with each scenario, you have a description of it, which again is for your test runner to point out, and you get a little checkbox next to it or not. And then you have your sort of 3 steps with each one. So the type of steps that you have are, like I say, given, when, and then, and you also have a background. So with the given, it's to highlight a prerequisite. So something like given I am on a home page. It's not something that you're actually testing, but it's something that you need to have happened to be able to then continue. When is the action taken that you want to actually test? So you might say, I click on the About Us link, especially if it's controlled by JavaScript or something. That might be something that you're testing. And then is the result. That's your assertion. Is then I'm taken to the About Us page. The background, that is sort of the equivalent of using before or before each or before all, depending on where you put them in standard unit tests. So you can sort of say, you can put in the background, inside that will be, given when and then. It's the same format as a scenario. But in the background, you could have, given that we have reset the database or something like that. You might want to, delete everything in between each one. You saw in the previous slide that I used and. So and takes the place of given, when, and then, but it just lets you sort of string on a couple of extra ones. So you see on lines 15 and 16 there, I've said and I enter the password and I click login, because those are 3 separate steps that I want to take place as an action. This is Alberto. Alberto was part of the theme template that I chose, and he doesn't know how to code, but he's still able to send requirements to the development team that can be turned into tests. So in this sort of simple format, this is a very simple format that you can describe to a client or to anyone who's product owning in this situation, and they're able to write these tests. You can have a quality assurance person who does not necessarily need to be writing as a developer. It also means that you can send these tests to people and they can say, well, that's not what we actually do, or like they can modify these things, they can read them, and it sort of skips away the step that you have to do when you're translating code between when you're reading it and when you're actually trying to talk to a client who maybe doesn't understand that. And that's all I'm going to cover for BDD, because I didn't have time to come up with an example for it. But you can use it to drive most applications, also most testing applications. I've seen it used quite a lot to drive Selenium. It's probably the most common one. In that case, you do say exactly what I have done there, which is like I want to be on this page and I want to be filling this in, and it lets you describe it just as you would if you were using it. So now, talking of Selenium, let's go on to talk about E2E testing, which is end-to-end testing. So if you have used Selenium before, it'll be very familiar. I'm going to talk about Cypress, which I think, I at least know Bradley has used before. And the idea here is that it uses the website as a user would. All it does is drive the browser. One of the advantages of Cypress is that it is also within the same run loop. So you can do a lot of the things that we were seeing with unit testing, which is like stubbing calls and mocking API, and you can essentially mock the entire server. So all your testing is the front end. So a common use for this is to implement sort of the common workflows that your users will be actually taking part in, and you have fully automated quality assurance. That's not saying that you don't ever need to load up the browser yourself. You should always be doing that anyway, because you'll find something that maybe this doesn't. But it will catch a lot of your regressions as you continue if you write these tests, and it's very easy to bolt on to existing code. It's one of the reasons I'm talking about it today. So I noticed the other day that you were doing some WordPress upgrades, and this is something that I definitely think in that sort of case is also useful. You can have that safety net and that assurance that if you just upgrade WordPress and you commit it, then in your continuous integration, you run the tests that you've already written, and it makes sure that every aspect of the website that you've written will still function as normal. And I think that's quite key when you're doing stuff like this. So let's look at an example. if I can get this to continue. Can you still see my browser there?
Yep.
Cool. Just pull up a terminal. So I have a copy of the Right-Minded website running. I don't have the uploads directory, so you'll have to excuse the big grey background. But this is the Right-Minded website, and it's the same code, and I've also got the database off of Live. So here, if I just open. So here I have written some Cypress code, which as you see is just very simple. We've only got 35 lines here, and I've written an entire set of tests for a feature. So the idea here is I've got a file called landing.spec.js. So I'm testing in this file the landing page. And the idea here is to split up the test into different files. Much as I think David Young pointed out, it's good to be able to split your test into different sections, because you don't necessarily want to be running everything every time you make a change, and you definitely don't want to be running it all on your local machine every time you run a change. So here I've written the code to check for the carousel features. So very simply, we're checking that when we load the page, we're visiting the page up here in the before each. So every test will run this before we get to it. We then check that this class, and we use the first one because they don't have an easily unique identifier, and I wanted to show that you could do this without changing any of the existing code you've already got. And so the way that this slider works is that there will be one slide with the opacity of 1 and one slide with the opacity of 0, and that's how we know which slide we're on. So we can see here that I'm making sure that the first slide is visible and the second slide is not. We then have another test that we don't need to make the same check that we've already done, so we can skip this and just click the next button, and then we can actually see that the first slide is now got the opacity of 0 and the second one has the opacity of 1. So I haven't tested this just before, so let's hope this still works. If I type in my Cypress command, it brings me up an interface to work with the test that I've written. So you can see here I've only actually written one. I can click on it. Here it loads up the Right-Minded website, and it makes the assertions that I've asked it to do on this left-hand side. And you can see both of these passed. But you also get the advantage here of it shows you the point in time. So it will show you what happens at every step of the way, and you can sort of just scroll through what happened when you were running your test. All the different steps will show up here. So you can see here that it got the feature and it clicked on it, and you can see what happened before and you can see what happened after. And so it lets you go back through. That's especially useful when a test fails, because you can then go back through and say, well, what actually happened? Why did my assertion fail? Because there was clearly something going on and it wasn't what I expected. So what was there before? What was there after? Yeah, exactly. So one of the other advantages of using this, I've only got Chrome 75 installed on this. You can see up in the top right-hand corner, we have a drop-down. Sorry, I do have Firefox and Electron. But you can, this will run on many different browsers, including Edge. I don't think it currently runs on Internet Explorer. There was some, I did see some topics where people were trying to make it work with Internet Explorer, but didn't see any success on that. But yeah, it will run on Edge, and you can get it to run on Canary and all sorts of browsers. And it will just, yeah, it will just run, and it will control the browser as you normally would. But of course, you know, if you're running this in CI, you don't want to have an interactive window pop up. And also, if you just want to run the test, you probably don't want to see it every time. So another way that you can run Cypress tests is to use npx Cypress run, which will just run them neatly in the command line. It will. You can select a different browser, but I'm just using Electron 80 because it is headless, which means that I don't need to have the browser pop up and get in my way. And you can just see the test pass, and it will also create a video of it performing the tests and store it into your repository. So nice and easy to keep track of. And you might, you know, in your continuous integration, have that marked as an artifact, which would let you get those videos out should something fail, and you've got access to everything. So sort of key thing that I wanted to point out with this code is that I haven't modified any of the Bright-Minded website to do this, and I still only needed, you know, a few lines of code to write each of these tests. And I still have plenty of comments for it. So this is very easy to retrofit onto existing websites, and it can mean that you can add testing when you didn't have to think about it before. So while unit testing is really important, unit testing can be really difficult to add once you've already written the code, because you then have to find a way to isolate it, and you know, you have to work out what you need to stop and things like that. Whereas when you're just using the browser, you've already designed it to be used in the browser. So this is just imitating what the user would see anyway. And you can do a lot of those things just through working with Cypress. So has anyone else used anything like Cypress or Selenium? Anything from your own experiences?
Was it Casper was one such tool, if I remember? Casper or Jasper, one of those?
Yeah, was that was also a Node one, wasn't it? That but I think that one exclusively ran headless.
Yes, that's true. That's the one I used a while ago. So my experience is only with that one, which was not as easy to use as this.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main focuses that they have. Like when you anywhere on the Cypress website, you have they'd like to talk about it being a painless experience for developers, and I personally think that's an attempt to try and make a bit of a dig at Selenium, because if you've ever used Selenium, it can be a bit of a pain, and especially when you have dynamic events and things. You know, you've got a lot of JavaScript happening. You might press a button, and after a while, something will happen. Cypress will naturally wait for you, whereas Selenium, you need to sort of explicitly tell it to do that, or tell it to poll for changes and things like that.
Yeah, this looks really nice.
And like I said, I've used this a little bit. Stumbling point I came across was in a CMS-driven project. It's quite hard to untangle your front end from the content. So, for example, if you're testing a product page, it's quite difficult to know what URL you should be going to, what elements are going to exist on any single product. And so I wasn't really sure of the best way to work around that, whether you should have a separate database set up just for running your tests against, or if you should have like config files, or I don't know if you've got any ideas about that, Sam.
That is actually very valid. That is something that I was encountering as well, and it's something that you definitely create your own structure for. So we've seen before using fixtures and things like that, which that there is a degree that you can just not use a database, and like, so you have, say you have like an Ajax call which pulls in data or something like that. You might then use Cypress to stop that call, or you might just store an example response from WordPress somewhere, so that when you're loading this page, you're actually responding with the stored call rather than what's fresh in the database. That's one way of doing it. I prefer the approach of having a separate database, which you would then populate, and you would populate with sample data, so everyone that's developing it would be using the same data to do the same tests, as well as using full workflows rather than just going onto a single page. So like you were saying with the links, yeah, if you're going directly to trying to go directly to a product page or something like that, that does make it quite difficult. But if you go to the product homepage, you scroll down and you select a product, WordPress is already, you utilize WordPress's features there, and it's already made that permalink for you. And you can sort of just leverage it a little bit more like the user would. It In that case, it does make it a little bit more reliant on other things. So your tests might fail because of a failure on another page, which is one of the risks. And that is a risk of using full end-to-end testing with common workflows. But at the same time, if you've got a bug on another page, that's still a bug you need to fix. And so it will pick this up. So I guess in that way, it's not as fine-grained and detailed as using something like unit tests. Or when you're able to use like Mocha and Chai with an API. But with this, you can bolt it on a bit more. So yeah, no, I definitely agree with you there. It's very difficult to try and pull that stuff out of a database. And so yeah, it definitely, I do prefer to use a separate database when I'm doing stuff like this, and sort of preload it with fake data so that everyone has got the same thing. But then at the same time, that also makes you run the tests a little bit less because it takes a little bit longer to run.
I use something fairly similar called Backstop.js, which is for visual regression testing. So it does the same sort of thing in that we have a headless Chrome, and it uses something called Puppeteer to control the page. But then it takes a sort of screenshot image, and this is used to see a sort of before or after for when you do a release. And I found that I was just giving it sort of a list of pages that I knew were different and had different data on, so that in the past we'd had problems in, probably the same way as a human would test. But I can see that this has some different use cases, such as you can actually read data back off the page or see what values filled in on the form. One question I've got is something I'm doing at the moment, whereas I'm testing a checkout flow where I go through several steps, but it's not a single page app. It goes from one page to the next. Do we come across a way of automating that, or doing things like clicking buttons through several pages?
Yes, I mean, I've not heard of Backstop.js. I'll definitely check that out after. But I know that there is also a plugin for visual regression testing for this. I can't vouch for it because I've not tried it, but I would say that it's there. With going through several pages, so if I I pull back up the test runner, yeah, when you're using the test runner, you see the test on the left hand side and the browser window on the right. So what it's actually doing internally here is it's got an iframe. So what it isn't dependent on the page that you're currently on. So it's almost detached in that it can the same way that your browser will take you to another page, it's still there and it's still waiting for the input. So you can still expect like I could follow this up with a visit for google.com, and my test runner could then start putting things into Google, and it's not dependent on the page that you started with. It will search for, it's kind of like how jQuery will just look for things as you ask for them, rather than search for it all at the beginning and then use them later on. So you can then just look for things that have now appeared on the page or on the new page that you're on. So you can definitely go through an entire flow across many pages. You could, in theory, if you were really desperate to, you could test your entire website in one sort of test run, and it's that would obviously make it very difficult to parallelize. But yeah, no, you can definitely cross multiple pages. You could do that entire flow, because in that case you are dependent on the data you've entered before. And yeah, you'll definitely see that all flow through in the same way that you would click the buttons.
Yeah, I can see why that would be really useful. Is there anything where you sort of wait for events before you know when to run the next test, if you're waiting for something to happen, or whether you've gone to your next page or the page is fully loaded?
There is. So Cypress tries to move away from using explicit waits and uses implicit waits. So built into a lot of their functions is sort of the concept of you wait until this appears, rather than in some test runners you will literally wait for 2 seconds, which then you start to get flaky tests when you do that. And I've seen a lot of tests fail on CI servers just because they've not waited long enough, or they waited so long that the thing came and went and stuff like that. So it can make it very flaky if you do an explicit wait. But yeah, Cypress will do things like polling, and it will wait for something to actually change on the DOM, and it will look for that then. I think there is a default limit which you can change as well if you know that a lot of the time something takes a little bit longer to show or something like that, because obviously you don't want to be stuck waiting forever, but you can configure that sort of thing. So yeah, it's definitely built to dynamically do things like this, and it takes a lot of it out of your hands. I was really surprised when I started working with this. It seems to take most of it out of your hands, and you just write the simplest code and they've written the rest of it for you.
To what extent have you used this, Sam? Have you done sort of a full project testing it as you go with Cypress?
So I've not used Cypress for a full build yet. I'm using it on a new build on a new React app that I'm working on, but I've not used it sort of end to end yet. So far it's going well, but I have used like much larger scale applications with Selenium and things like that, and I know that they were. That's why a lot of the time I'm sort of going back to talking about the advantages of Cypress over Selenium, is that we saw a lot of failures over time with Selenium, just sort of like as you made it bigger, the code got a lot more complicated, and so far I've not experienced that with Cypress. So it might get a lot more as I get a lot further through, and I'll let you know if it doesn't go well. But so far, I've not really seen like the code base expanding or anything like that. But yeah, like I said, I've not done a full end-to-end build yet. I suppose in a way that's part of why I was interested to try and implement it on the Right-Minded website here, is that I really wanted to see how easy it was to retrofit it. And like I just picked the first feature on the website, and it was quite easy to do. I just pulled up developer tools to see how it was done by someone else, because I didn't write that feature. I'm sure probably someone in this chat did, so I'm definitely not going to claim responsibility for it. And then I saw how someone else had written that, and it was very easy to add the code to test how they'd done it, which makes it very nice to sort of go back to an old project that you might not be actively maintaining, but you still want to make sure will always work. Which sort of brings me back to those things like, when you've got a third-party plugin or something like that updating, this will catch it quite well. And especially when you pair it with something like visual regression testing, that is, like the two of them combined, you've got then the functionality and the styling, and I think that is very, very useful.
How far would you go using these tools? For example, I don't think you would actually write tests for your carousel, or would you?
Probably in this case, I would. I think that because in that case you're not necessarily passing data through functions, and you're not expecting things to change. So using unit tests can be a little bit more difficult with that. I suppose in a way that is a unit test, but it's just implementing it through a different medium. But I wouldn't necessarily implement a test on every little feature, because you want to try and get the idea that, like what does a user actually do, and how different sections of your website can influence others. That's one issue that you can have when you're only testing small chunks, is that that this small chunk works, but you don't know that when this small chunk works, it actually turns something further down in the page to a dragon. You just don't know that happens, because you've only tested that small chunk, and you've tested the other small chunk independently. So if you say that usually my user is, well, I mean, to take the checkout example there, you're saying usually my user is going through their browsing a little bit. They might go to page 3. They then add 4 different items to their cart. They then go to the checkout. They then click checkout. They enter their details. They go through the process, and at the end, you make sure that you see that list where you've got all of the correct items, and everything that you expect is in that situation. And I think that's quite valuable. Like, I'm not saying that you should only do that by any means, because you definitely want to have quicker tests that you can run when you're only changing small sections. But especially when you're running this on continuous integration, you might just be running them like once a day overnight or something, if you've got a massive project. But I think for most of these WordPress projects, you can probably just run them on every push. But yeah, you can have I think that's the difference of like when you're retrofitting versus when you're building something new. When you're building something new, I would build a test for every small section, whereas retrofitting, I would build more around the workflow concept.
And so you raised an interesting point where this is very useful with things, say, like WordPress upgrades, which might break something from an existing site. So if, and this is addressed to anyone, not just Sam, if you guys can think of what for something like for example, something as, I mean, comparatively with some other sites that we have, the Right-Minded site is quite simple. It doesn't do very much. But if we wanted to have a test for breaking changes in WordPress, what do you think we would test? How would we use Cypress to make sure that upgrades, after our upgrades, we still have working code? What would be the point? Anyone can answer this because
Does this not depend on the risks, Chris? So I'm thinking when Sam was talking about testing whether the slider works, and I'm thinking if I was a customer, I'd be annoyed that my money was spent on something like testing that a slider worked. I've just done an upgrade for Bover, on the other hand, where I've had to go through 4 different types of putting stuff in my basket, depending on whether they're being sold to a client or the vet is a fish or whatever the complicated bits for Bover are, because that's their income stream. And I need to make sure that the order paperwork is correct, because if they fall foul of the legislation, they're going to be in trouble. These things are proper threats to their business. If it doesn't look right, I'm not sure that anybody would care. They'd get on the phone and say something's gone slightly wrong here. Whereas if I just lost them £500,000, they bloody well would care. So I can see having it being useful for something like Bover with a set of WordPress upgrades to be able to check the e-commerce functions and the legal aspects of the site. But absolutely not whether the HTML layout correctly or not. It just doesn't seem to matter in the same way. I have that my clients are paying for. Some other people, they may have no look and feel whatsoever, but the layout is critical to them. It surely must be very context sensitive.
It feels like there's classes of layout issue caused by, for example, your gulp not compiling correctly, though, and so it feels like just having a fairly small number of UI-driven tests could probably catch quite a lot of fairly critical stuff. So you wouldn't need much to know if your JavaScript didn't compile at all versus whether every individual bit of it worked.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you both there. It's you've got to at the end of the day, your clients want you to cut corners, but they want you to cut the right corners, and it's definitely going to be based on what their websites are and how they actually function. But then like a lot of like as Bradley was saying just there, if you're we use gulp on probably most websites, I'd say now, I think, right?
Yeah.
So in that case, you write your you can write your very basic regression tests for your very basic visual regression tests, and they can probably largely be copy and pasted across projects. With only some small tweaks, you might have almost like another, not quite a plugin that can be moved across projects, but almost like a folder of common tests that we use that then just get slightly configured differently for the project and can be reused. So it's not necessarily always going to be we sat down and we use this client's money for writing a test to check the carousel, so much as we use some common tests that we've written for someone who does care about that because we have them anyway. And
I think that both of you touched on an interesting point there. We have tripped up more than once on our post-deployment checks. So things like did gulp compile properly? Is the CSS minified properly? Have we enabled robots or disabled robots, depending on the context? Is it staged or not staged? Some tests like that would be very useful, just to make sure that we've done the deployment correctly.
I mean, that's one thing I was also going to say in response to what Chris said earlier. Stuff around SEO titles and schema data is the sort of thing which can go weeks without anyone noticing has broken and can have quite a critical impact. It's also something that very much relies on you knowing the state of the database. So you can't test what a title should be unless you know with confidence what the title of the page is.
That's very true with the you can't test maybe the title, but you can test that there is content there, and you can test that the class is correct. So you might there's often some things which will always be static if it's not the content. So like you know, even in this case, like I've tested them, but I haven't tested that it's the correct images. And that's just because the images are fully dependent on what's entered in WordPress, and you know, I just don't have the images on my computer, so I can't really test that. What I am able to test is the things that we know will be static there in each case, which is the class, and we know that the position in the DOM will be the same. But when you're using things like one thing that I would be really interested in, especially if anyone knew how to do it, would be, because Cypress is just visiting a URL. It doesn't. It's not running, you know, an Apache server inside it. It is just visiting the URL that I've already got running. So it can visit your live website after you've done the deployment. I'd be wondering if you could then do some form of test on staging, do your deployment, and then run a very basic test on live to then just sort of say, is this what I saw on staging? Because when you're using, you know, if you've got a pull request to do an automatic deployment, you've then got that automatic check, like you were saying, and you've got, it'd be really nice if you could, well, I'm sure there is a way to do a full test of that and then roll back if you don't see, or if there's like a level of difference between the visual regression. I'm sure there's a way to do that with the visual regression testing. I think David Young, you probably used that a little bit more than I have, so you might.
Yeah, you basically get a folder of all the image files for each of the tests that you've done, and then you can just sort of confirm those or accept them once you've got them looking the way they're good. And then when you've made a change or done a new release, or you want to check a different server, you just run that test again, and it compares it to the previously accepted images. And if the changes are the changes you want, you just accept those changes, and then that becomes the current set of good images.
Okay, so can you set something like a threshold to sort of accept a certain number?
If there was different data on, say, production than on your testing server, on staging, then you might expect some differences, in which case you can set a threshold, and if it's too sensitive, it's even going to pick up things like how sharp your fonts are across different browser types or something like that, and you don't necessarily want it picking up things at that fine level.
Okay, so I mean, I guess there in that case, you know, you have your, you know, we could do, like you were saying, that, you know, do a staging situation, deploy it, do a comparison, and then we've got a threshold there to say we've got a different amount of data on live to staging, and so that we expect this amount of difference. And then, yeah, you've got
the different difficulties that you come across. The same with this, in that you have to wait for jQuery to fully load, or you might have some race conditions and so on. So you need to run your tests at the right time if you want consistency. And it's the same with visual regression testing. So it might be that you've got a pop-up that sort of animates, and so if it takes a picture 2 seconds after the page load instead of 3 seconds or something, then you're actually going to get a difference. And so the first thing you do is set up your test. You might want to just hide that pop-up because it might not be what you're testing before it takes its screenshots. Or if a page automatically scrolls or something like that, then they're going to be 2 different images because they'll be in different positions at different stages in time.
Okay, that's quite interesting, but it definitely sounds like there's, you know, like there is a way, essentially.
Yeah,
So we can do it.
One other thing is, obviously one of the use cases is to make it easier for customers to test, but I think it's also a good tool to help with development. So with the carousel, for example, I might not run tests to test a carousel I've just imported with jQuery or that's on an existing site. But if I'm the person that's developing that carousel, it's quite useful to have these tests while you're developing it. And then when you deploy it, just see that you don't have any unwanted side effects on different pages.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like this is definitely, like, at the end of the day, the actual like Cypress code that is getting pulled through by your like Cucumber is written by the developer, and I think those are the bits that you're making sure that you're not changing anything while you're writing it. I think particularly the way that Cucumber will help in terms of the client is just that you can directly turn a requirement into a test, and it's very it'll be very much like you pick out a sentence out of a requirements document, and you can very easily turn that into a sentence that fits in Cucumber. So you're just there's less interpretation, I think, is part of that. You don't want to be you want to directly turn the requirements from the customer into what you're already testing, because you know that they're going to ask for that. So why not just make it automatically tell you that you're not doing it if you're not doing it. So I guess one of the things that I really want you to take away here is that it doesn't have to be all or nothing with testing. You don't necessarily have to be making sure that every single line of code is covered by a test, although that would be nice, especially if you haven't written tests from the beginning, and especially if you've got a tight deadline. That can be very difficult to do, and going back and fitting a common workflow or something that we know someone is going to ask for can be very valuable, in that you just don't need to test for it later on, and there's less repetition, there's less of a developer's time spent just scrolling through pages and making sure that we've clicked on the right things. And so I hope that you will consider this for your next project that you get to work on with Bright Minded.
Awesome, man. Thanks. Here's the applause, man. Thanks, Alan. That was awesome. Thank you very much, man.
Thank you, Sam.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers,
All
Simon.
right.
Guys, have a good weekend.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks.